So King Charles watched his wife of nearly 20 years get escorted out of Clarence House with 48 hours' notice, and the reason isn't what anyone expected. We're not talking about marriage problems or behind-the-scenes tension or some slow-building separation. We're talking about secret bank accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands that nobody knew existed until a routine audit tripped over them, and the fallout was so fast and so severe that even the people inside the palace are still trying to figure out how this actually happened. Before we get into it, if you're new here on Crown Watch, hit subscribe so you don't miss the updates on this one, because the investigation is still unfolding. The statement dropped at 6:47 in the morning on December 3rd. Not a vague palace statement with careful diplomatic language, not the kind of thing where you have to read between the lines to figure out what they're actually saying. This was direct. Buckingham Palace announced that the king had formally requested parliamentary action regarding the titles and status of Camilla Parker Bowles, specifically using her pre-marriage name, which was the first signal that something had gone very wrong. The statement said serious financial irregularities and undisclosed accounts had been discovered, and that continuing the Queen Consort title was no longer appropriate. That's not a separation announcement. That's an institutional severing. And the fact that they dropped it at 6:47 in the morning, before most people had even started their day, tells you they wanted this out there immediately. No waiting for a news cycle. No careful timing. Just get it out. What makes this genuinely unusual is the speed. Financial scandals in any institution, especially the monarchy, typically drag out for months. Investigations happen behind closed doors. Lawyers review everything. Communications teams craft careful messaging. And by the time the public hears about it, the whole thing has been managed into something survivable. That didn't happen here. The timeline from discovery to announcement was 5 days. 5 days from Charles learning about these accounts to Camilla being legally stripped of titles she'd spent 2 decades earning. That's not institutional caution. That's either overwhelming evidence or a level of personal fury that overrode every normal instinct towards slow management. And from what we now know, it was both. The whole thing started because of something genuinely boring. In May of 2025, Parliament passed legislation requiring enhanced financial transparency for senior royals receiving public funding. This wasn't targeting anyone specifically. It was the kind of modernization push that governments like to do, driven by public pressure for accountability, independent audits, full disclosure of assets, quarterly reporting of significant transactions, standard governance stuff that any public institution should probably already be doing. The audit firm Reynolds Partners started their comprehensive review in September. They began with the most senior figures, which meant the king first, then the Queen Consort's office. And honestly, the Queen Consort's finances were supposed to be straightforward: an allowance from the Duchy of Lancaster, some personal wealth from a previous marriage settlement, standard household expenses properly documented. Nobody expected to find anything interesting. But an auditor named Sarah Mitchell noticed something odd in October while reviewing payment authorizations. There were monthly payments going to what appeared to be a financial management firm in Luxembourg. The amounts weren't enormous, about £5,000 per month, but they weren't properly categorized in the palace accounting system. When Mitchell requested documentation explaining these payments, the responses came back vague. Something about estate management services, no real specificity. And if you've ever worked in auditing or compliance, you know that vague answers to specific questions are basically a signal flare. Mitchell followed standard protocol and requested direct communication with the Luxembourg firm. What she discovered was that the entity wasn't managing any legitimate estates connected to Camilla. It was a shell company whose primary function appeared to be receiving funds from various sources and distributing them to accounts held in Camilla's name in multiple jurisdictions. The shell company itself was owned by another corporate entity registered in the British Virgin Islands, which created layers of obscurity that any auditor would immediately recognize as a deliberate structure designed to conceal financial activity. That's where the thing starts to unravel. Once Mitchell escalated to her senior partners and the palace was brought in, forensic accountants got involved, and the picture expanded rapidly. 3 separate accounts at banks in Geneva and Zurich, opened between 2003 and 2005, containing combined balances of approximately £3.2 million Transaction history showed regular deposits from various sources, some from British entities, others from accounts in jurisdictions that made tracing difficult. Withdrawals were minimal, which suggested these accounts were primarily for accumulation rather than spending. Then, the Cayman Islands accounts opened in 2007, shortly after Camilla's marriage to Charles, containing over £4 million. The source of funds appeared to be primarily UK-based transfers, but routed through intermediate accounts that obscured their origin. And here's the detail that makes the timeline particularly damaging. Deposits had continued regularly through 2024. This wasn't old money from before the marriage that she'd forgotten about. This was ongoing activity throughout her entire time as Duchess of Cornwall and Queen Consort. Active concealment, not passive omission. Luxembourg held the third major cluster, approximately £1.3 million, which seemed to serve as a collection point for various smaller payments that were then distributed to the Swiss and Cayman accounts. The structure suggested sophisticated planning. Someone had thought about how to move money in ways that wouldn't be obvious, which is not the kind of thing you do by accident or because you just never got around to mentioning some old family accounts. When investigators started tracing where the money actually came from, the patterns got troubling. Some appeared to come from wealthy individuals with connections to Prince Andrew's social circle, including several who'd been associated with controversial figures or businesses under investigation for financial irregularities. Other deposits traced to companies operating in sectors where a royal connection might provide business advantage. Now, nobody has proven direct pay-for-access arrangements, but the timing of certain deposits relative to events Camilla hosted or causes she advocated for created patterns that investigators found concerning. And then there's the Andrew connection, which is where this gets even messier. The timing of certain deposits into Camilla's accounts corresponded with periods when Andrew was known to be seeking funds to cover legal expenses or settlement costs. No direct transfers between Andrew and Camilla could be proven, but the circumstantial timing suggested possible coordination or shared financial strategies. That's a lot of coincidences stacking up. Princess Anne was brought into the investigation in mid-November when palace officials realized the scope extended beyond simple, undisclosed assets into potentially criminal territory. Anne's reaction, according to those briefed on the investigation, was horror. She reportedly said, "This isn't just hidden money. This is a structure designed to conceal ongoing financial activity from family, from palace officials, and from authorities." That level of planning suggests consciousness of wrongdoing, not innocent oversight. Anne's involvement proved crucial because she initially inclined toward handling things quietly to avoid scandal, but as the investigation revealed the extent of concealment and the troubling sources of some funds, she concluded that protecting the institution required transparency, even if it meant destroying Charles's marriage and Camilla's position. William was briefed on November 25th, 3 days before Charles would learn the full truth. Palace legal counsel walked him through the documentation, the account structures, the timeline, and the potential implications. William's immediate concern was whether his father might be implicated, whether Charles could have known about the accounts and failed to disclose them. The investigation found no evidence Charles knew, but William recognized that the question would inevitably be raised publicly and that managing that perception would be almost as difficult as managing the actual scandal. Charles was informed on November 28th, and those present described it as one of the most difficult briefings of his reign. Senior advisors presented him with documentation showing the accounts, the amounts, the timeline of their creation, and the mysterious sources of funding. Charles's initial reaction was disbelief. He kept insisting there must be innocent explanations, administrative errors, misunderstandings, but as he reviewed the evidence, the reality became unavoidable. She'd been hiding millions from him for their entire marriage, while he'd been defending her publicly, supporting her rehabilitation, trusting her completely. She'd been concealing wealth he didn't know existed. His question to advisors was devastating in its simplicity. "She's been hiding millions from me for our entire marriage," he said, his voice hollow. "While I've been defending her publicly, supporting her rehabilitation, trusting her completely, she's been concealing wealth I didn't know existed." The confrontation happened that same evening at Clarence House. Charles dismissed even his private secretary and most trusted aides. Only two protection officers remained within calling distance, standard security protocol that couldn't be waived. When Camilla entered the study at 7:15 p.m., she knew something was wrong, but not the full scope. Charles was sitting behind his desk rather than in the informal seating area where they typically talked, creating a barrier that was as much emotional as physical. He laid out the financial documentation on his desk, bank statements, account opening records, transaction histories, corporate structures, all printed and organized chronologically. He didn't speak at first. He just gestured for her to look. The silence, he later told William, was because he genuinely wanted to believe there was an explanation he hadn't considered, some innocent reason for decades of hidden accounts. Camilla's initial response was denial, not of the accounts themselves, but of any wrongdoing. She insisted these were old accounts from before their marriage, family money she'd kept separate, nothing that needed to be disclosed. But as Charles pushed, pointing to transaction dates clearly showing activity throughout their marriage and into her time as queen consort, the denials became less confident and more defensive. The turning point came when Charles confronted her with evidence of connections to individuals in Andrew's orbit, timing that suggested coordination during Andrew's financial crisis, patterns that looked like something beyond simple private savings. He asked her directly what she was involved in, because this didn't look like savings. It looked like money laundering or receiving payments for influence or something equally damaging. It was then that Camilla's composure cracked. She insisted she'd been protecting the family, that Andrew had come to her years ago, desperate for help navigating financial troubles, that she'd been trying to help without involving Charles in situations that would have forced him to choose between brother and propriety. The accounts had been Andrew's idea, she claimed, ways to receive and hold funds without direct connection to him, funneling them through her accounts before they could be moved to pay his debts or legal expenses. Now, if that's true, it makes Camilla complicit in potentially illegal financial schemes to help Andrew evade accountability. If it's false, it's an attempt to shift blame to someone already discredited. Either way, it confirmed Charles's worst fears. The woman he trusted completely had been involved in financial arrangements she had deliberately concealed, arrangements connected to the family member whose scandals had most damaged the monarchy. Charles asked the question that mattered most to him personally. Did she marry him with these accounts already in place, already hiding this from him? Camilla's answer, hesitant and qualified, was effectively yes. She'd had some of the accounts before they'd married, had opened others after, but had never told him because she'd known he would have insisted they'd be disclosed or closed, and she'd felt obligated to help Andrew in ways Charles couldn't officially support. That justification apparently infuriated Charles more than the concealment itself. He told her she'd made him complicit in her deception every time he defended her publicly, every time he supported her rehabilitation. Every time he told the public to trust her, he was vouching for someone who was lying to him about fundamental aspects of her life. He asked if she understood what she'd done to his credibility, to the institution. Camilla tried to argue that the amounts weren't enormous by royal standards, that no public money was involved, that she'd never used her position for personal enrichment, but only to help family. Charles cut through these rationalizations with what those briefs later described as devastating precision. The amount doesn't matter, he told her. The source being public funds doesn't matter. What matters is that you concealed millions in assets, potentially received money from suspicious sources, and lied to me about it for years. That's not a family matter. That's institutional liability. The conversation deteriorated from there into recriminations and emotional outbursts that those outside could hear but not distinguish. When Camilla emerged 3 hours later, palace staff reported she looked shattered, mascara smeared, moving unsteadily. She went directly to her private apartments without speaking to anyone. Charles called for his private secretary and legal counsel immediately. His instructions were clear and non-negotiable. He wanted a full legal analysis of what was required to remove her titles. He wanted her out of Clarence House within 48 hours, and he wanted a statement prepared explaining why this action was necessary. When advisors cautiously suggested this might be too fast, that perhaps they should investigate further before taking irreversible action, Charles was immovable. She admitted substantial concealment of accounts connected to Andrew's problems. He said, "That's enough. I will not allow the Crown to be implicated. in whatever financial scheme she was involved in. William was summoned to Clarence House at midnight. He found his father devastated but resolute. Charles told him this wasn't an emotional reaction, despite how it looked. She'd created institutional liability through deception, and as king, he couldn't overlook that, regardless of his personal feelings. William agreed that action was necessary, but suggested more time for proper legal process. Charles refused. Every day she remains queen consort. While we know about this concealment is another day of institutional dishonesty, he said. It ends now. The legal mechanism for removing Camilla's titles proved more complex than Charles's urgency wanted to allow. Unlike private citizens who can simply divorce and be done, removing royal titles required parliamentary action, Privy Council involvement, and navigation of constitutional precedent that had rarely been tested. The palace legal team worked through the night of November 28th and into the following day researching historical precedents. The closest comparison was the removal of titles from German relatives during World War I, but that involved foreign royals, not a queen consort. There was also the abdication crisis of 1936, but that was voluntary abdication, not forced removal. What Charles wanted, stripping a sitting queen consort of her titles due to financial misconduct, had no direct precedent in modern royal history. The legal team determined that several steps were required. Charles needed to formally request Parliament take action through the Home Secretary. The Privy Council would need to advise on the constitutional propriety of such action. Parliament would likely need to pass specific legislation authorizing removal of the titles granted by letters patent upon Charles and Camilla's marriage. The entire process could take weeks or months under normal circumstances, but Charles instructed his legal team to invoke emergency procedures to make clear to parliamentary officials that time was of the essence and to use every available mechanism to accelerate action. His position was that continuing Camilla's title while investigations proceeded would make the crown complicit in whatever impropriety the accounts represented. The emergency Privy Council session convened on November 30th at Buckingham Palace. Senior government ministers, judges, and royal advisors formed the constitutional body that advised the crown on matters of highest importance. The meeting was unprecedented in modern times for its speed and subject matter. Palace Council presented the evidence of undisclosed accounts, the amounts involved, the troubling sources of some funds, and Camilla's admission of deliberate concealment. The legal argument was straightforward. Continuation of the queen consort title under these circumstances created institutional liability and undermined public trust in the monarchy's financial propriety. Removal of titles was a proportionate response to a serious breach of trust affecting the crown's reputation. The Privy Council's deliberation took hours, with several members expressing concern about the precedent being set and the optics of a king essentially divorcing his wife through institutional mechanisms rather than personal ones. But ultimately, the constitutional weight of the king's position prevailed. The Privy Council advised that parliamentary action to remove titles would be constitutionally proper given the circumstances presented. Simultaneously, government officials had been briefed on the situation, and the king's request for emergency parliamentary action. The prime minister, after consultation with senior ministers and the leader of the opposition, agreed to introduce emergency legislation that would authorize removal of titles granted to Camilla upon marriage. The speed of this agreement reflected both the gravity of the evidence and the government's desire to support the monarchy through a crisis that could undermine public confidence in the institution. The legislation, drafted overnight and introduced to Parliament on December 1st, was brief and specific. It authorized removal of titles of Queen Consort, Duchess of Cornwall, and all other titles and styles granted to Camilla Parker Bowles upon her marriage to the then Prince of Wales, on grounds that serious financial irregularities had been discovered that made continuation of said titles inappropriate and potentially damaging to the crown. Parliamentary debate was limited due to the emergency nature of the legislation, but what discussion occurred revealed deep division. Some MPs argued this was appropriate accountability for someone who'd held public position while concealing substantial wealth. Others suggested it was disproportionate, that financial irregularities could be addressed without completely destroying someone's status and title. A few raised concerns about the precedent of allowing the Crown to use Parliament to essentially punish a personal betrayal. The vote, held late on December 2nd, passed with a strong majority but not overwhelming support. The legislation received royal assent immediately, with Charles signing away his wife's titles in what palace observers described as the most painful constitutional duty he'd ever performed. His personal statement, released alongside the parliamentary action, was brief but devastating. He said it was with profound sadness that he had requested parliamentary action regarding titles held by Camilla Parker Bowles. The discovery of serious financial irregularities and substantial undisclosed accounts had made continuation of the Queen Consort title untenable. This action was taken to protect the integrity of the Crown, not as personal vindictiveness, but as necessary institutional preservation. He asked for privacy as he navigated this personally devastating but institutionally necessary decision. Camilla's response, delivered through lawyers rather than personal statement, challenged the characterization of the accounts as misconduct and reserved all legal rights to contest the removal of titles. But legally, once Parliament had acted and the King had signed, the titles were gone. Camilla Parker Bowles was no longer Queen Consort, no longer Duchess, no longer anything but a private citizen whose marriage to the King was intact in name only, while effectively destroyed in every meaningful sense. The public reaction split along fault lines that revealed deep divisions in British society. Older citizens, particularly those who remembered the Diana years and Camilla's long rehabilitation, expressed complicated sympathy. Many felt Charles had acted too harshly, that financial irregularities, however serious, didn't warrant complete destruction of someone who'd finally earned public acceptance. Online forums filled with comments defending Camilla, suggesting she was being scapegoated, arguing that hidden accounts didn't justify such severe punishment. But younger demographics, particularly those focused on accountability and transparency, supported Charles's action more strongly. They viewed the hidden millions as fundamental betrayal, particularly offensive given the monarchy's use of public funding and recent pushes for financial transparency. The fact that Camilla had concealed substantial wealth while the nation faced economic hardship created anger that transcended sympathy for her personal situation. The international reaction was equally divided. American media, never quite comfortable with Camilla given the Diana narrative, framed the scandal as vindication of doubts about her character. European outlets, more familiar with royal financial scandals, treated it as serious but not unprecedented. Commonwealth nations watched nervously, concerned that instability at the heart of the monarchy could affect their own constitutional arrangements. The financial investigation, rather than concluding with Camilla's title removal, intensified once the story became public. Additional information began emerging from people who'd had dealings with the offshore accounts. Several British businessmen came forward, admitting they'd made payments to entities connected to Camilla's accounts, payments they described as charitable contributions or business consultancy fees, but which investigators suspected might have been disguised influence payments. Most troubling were revelations about the timing of certain deposits relative to royal events and decisions. Analysis showed that significant payments had arrived in Camilla's accounts within weeks of her hosting events attended by wealthy individuals or following her advocacy for certain causes that benefited specific industries. While no direct quid pro quo could be proven, the pattern suggested at minimum the appearance of pay-for-access arrangements. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, Camilla's children from her first marriage, mounted a vigorous public defense of their mother. In a joint statement, they insisted she'd been trying to help Prince Andrew navigate impossible financial situations, that her concealment had been motivated by a desire to protect Charles from having to know about or participate in difficult family bailouts, and that she'd never used her position for personal enrichment. The defense was heartfelt, but undermined by the sheer amounts involved and the sophisticated structures used to conceal the money. If you're just trying to help a family member, you don't need shell companies in Luxembourg and accounts in the Cayman Islands. That level of structure suggests something more calculated than a family favor. For Charles personally, the aftermath was devastating in ways that transcended the public scandal. He'd spent nearly 50 years loving Camilla, had endured enormous public hostility to be with her, and had fought for her acceptance as his wife and queen. To discover that throughout their marriage, she'd been concealing financial arrangements connected to his most problematic family member felt like a betrayal that went beyond financial impropriety and fundamental questions about whether he'd ever truly known his wife. Those close to Charles reported he'd aged visibly in the days following the title removal, moving through his duties with mechanical precision, but without the engagement that had always characterized his approach to kingship. He moved out of Clarence House himself, unable to remain in the space so connected to Camilla, taking up residence in Buckingham Palace apartments he'd previously avoided as too formal and cold. William's position was complicated by his need to support his father while managing his own expanding responsibilities as heir apparent. He issued a statement supporting Charles's decision as institutionally necessary, but privately he struggled with the precedent being set. If the king could strip titles from a queen consort for financial misconduct, what message did that send about royal marriages, about the permanence of positions earned through decades of service, about whether any title was truly secure? Catherine found herself thrust into a role she'd never expected to occupy quite so soon. With Camilla gone, she became the senior female royal supporting the king, taking on patronages and responsibilities she'd anticipated having more time to prepare for. Friends described her as rising to the challenge while privately concerned about the toll the scandal was taking on Charles and on the institution itself. The constitutional questions remained unresolved and troubling. Parliament had acted to remove Camilla's titles, but they'd done so at the king's request regarding his own wife. This created a precedent where the monarch could effectively use parliamentary power to punish personal betrayals by dressing them in institutional necessity. Constitutional scholars debated whether this was appropriate use of Crown-Parliament cooperation or a dangerous precedent that could be abused. There were also questions about what Charles had known and when. While investigations found no evidence he'd been aware of the hidden accounts before November 2025, some commentators suggested it strained credibility that Camilla had managed such extensive financial concealment for decades without any warning signs. The question of whether Charles might have willfully ignored suspicions to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths lingered uncomfortably. As December continued, the scandal showed no signs of fading. New revelations emerged regularly, each one adding details that made Camilla's actions look more calculated and Charles's response more justified, or alternatively made the punishment seem increasingly disproportionate to the offense, depending on one's perspective. What had become clear was that Charles had made a choice that defined his reign in ways he never anticipated. He'd chosen institutional preservation over personal loyalty, transparency over discretion, accountability over forgiveness. Whether history would judge that choice as strength or cruelty, wisdom or overreaction remained to be seen. But for Charles himself, sitting alone in Buckingham Palace while his wife of nearly 20 years lived in exile, under a legal cloud, the personal cost of that choice was already devastatingly apparent. What this whole situation illuminates is the impossible weight of being both husband and king, of loving someone while serving an institution that cannot tolerate deception. Charles faced a choice no one should have to make: protect the woman he'd spent his life defending or protect the crown he'd sworn to serve. He chose the institution, and that choice will follow him regardless of whether it was right. For Camilla, the tragedy was complete. She'd spent decades rebuilding her reputation, earning public acceptance through relentless service and dignity. Whatever her motivations for hiding those accounts, whether helping Andrew or protecting Charles or serving her own interests, the revelation destroyed everything she'd built. Her rehabilitation was erased in 72 hours. The hidden accounts weren't just money. They were lies of omission maintained for years, eroding the foundation of trust that any marriage requires. When that foundation cracked, everything built upon it collapsed simultaneously. Sometimes love isn't enough to overcome betrayal. Sometimes duty demands choices that break everything you thought was solid. And sometimes the price of wearing a crown is discovering that the person you trusted most had been hiding who they really were all along.